The wind in the high country doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care about the names people called you back in the city or the mistakes that haunt your sleep. Up here, on the ridge, the only thing that matters is if you can weather the storm. She stood there, her hands trembling, eyes fixed on the floorboards of a cabin that smelled of pine and hard-earned peace. She had a secret, a heavy, jagged thing that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. She looked up at him, her voice barely a breath. "Will you still keep me if I'm ruined?" Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. Today, we journey into the heart of the mountains to witness a story of true redemption and the strength of the human spirit. If you find peace in these tales of the Old West, please subscribe and join our community. Now, let us begin.
The train station at Clear Creek wasn't much more than a wooden platform and a pile of coal. It sat at the very edge of the world. This was where the iron tracks finally gave up against the steep rise of the mountains. Bramwell Holloway stood by his wagon, his coat collar turned up against the biting wind. It was late autumn. The air held the sharp, metallic scent of coming snow. Bram wasn't a man of many words. He was a carpenter by trade. He understood the grain of oak and the strength of a well-placed notch. He had built his life on the ridge with his own two hands. But the mountains are a lonely place when the sun goes down. A homestead needs two souls to survive the winter, one to provide and one to keep the hearthlight burning. In the late 1800s, many men in the West sent letters to the East looking for wives. These were often called proxy marriages. They were arrangements built more on necessity than romance. It was a massive gamble for both sides. The train hissed, releasing a cloud of steam that swallowed the platform. As the white vapor cleared, the passengers stepped down. One by one, the women were met. A miner hugged a weary-looking lady. A farmer took the trunk of a young girl. Soon the platform was nearly empty. Only one woman remained. She sat on a small, battered leather trunk. Her dress was fine, but it was faded and thin. She wore a wool shawl that offered little protection against the mountain chill. Her name was Verity Miller. Bram only knew her from a single short letter he had received 3 months ago. He walked toward her. His heavy boots thudded on the frost-covered wood. He noticed she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on her own hands. They were gripped tightly in her lap. She looked fragile, like a piece of glass in a world made of granite. "Miss Miller?" Bram's voice was deep, like the rumble of a distant rock slide. She flinched. When she looked up, her eyes weren't filled with the hope Bram expected. They were filled with a quiet, desperate terror. She didn't stand up. She didn't smile. She just looked at the rugged man before her and the vast, unforgiving peaks behind him. Bram reached for her trunk, but she placed a hand on it, stopping him. "Mr. Holloway?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Before we go, you should know I am not the woman you think I am."
Bram looked at Verity's hand resting on the trunk. It was small, the skin pale and reddened by the cold. He didn't ask her what she meant. He didn't demand an explanation for the fear in her eyes. In the mountains, a man learns quickly that everyone has a shadow following them. "The sun doesn't wait for talk, Miss Miller," Bram said quietly, "and the pass gets treacherous after dark. Whatever you think you aren't, the mountain will decide what you are soon enough." He lifted the heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing at all and secured it in the back of the wagon. He helped her onto the high bench, handing her a thick buffalo robe. As the horses pulled away from the station, the rhythmic clack-clack of the train faded, replaced by the creak of leather and the whistling wind. The trail up to the ridge was a masterpiece of pioneer engineering. These roads were carved by hand, following the natural contours of the land to avoid the steepest inclines. As they climbed, Bram pointed out the transition of the forest. Down low, the cottonwoods were golden, but as they ascended, the air grew thin and the massive ponderosa pines took over. "Those trees," Bram said, gesturing with his chin, "they grow slow because of the wind. It makes the wood dense. It makes it strong. Sometimes the hardest life produces the best timber." Verity remained silent, pulling the robe tighter. She watched the clouds swirl around the jagged peaks. Back east, she had heard stories of the frontier, but she hadn't realized how small it would make her feel. The scale of the wilderness was overwhelming. Every mile they traveled was a mile further from the world she knew and the people who had judged her. By the time they reached the homestead, the light was a bruised purple. The cabin sat in a small meadow, sheltered by a towering rock face that Bram called the Shield. It was a sturdy structure, built from hand-hewn logs. The corners were joined with a dovetail notch, a technique that used the weight of the logs to lock them together, making the house stronger as it settled. Bram led her inside. The cabin was cold and smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. He immediately went to the hearth. He didn't use a match. Those were expensive and hard to come by. Instead, he took a piece of charred cloth and a striker, throwing sparks into a nest of dry cedar shavings until a small flame licked upward. "This is home," he said, the firelight casting long shadows across his weathered face. Verity stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the single bed in the corner, the heavy wooden table, and the darkness pressing against the windows. She felt like a bird trapped in a box. Bram turned to her, sensing her panic. "You'll sleep in the loft," he said, pointing to a sturdy ladder. "It's warmer up there. I'll be down here by the fire." He handed her a tin cup of water. As she took it, her fingers brushed his. She pulled back as if burned. Bram watched her, his expression unreadable. He could see she was waiting for him to make a demand, to claim what the law said was his. "Tomorrow, the work begins. There's no room for ghosts in this cabin, Verity. Only the living." She nodded, but as she climbed the ladder to the loft, she wondered if the woman she used to be would ever truly stay behind in the valley. The first morning on the ridge arrived with a silence so deep it felt heavy. When Verity climbed down from the loft, she found the windows etched with delicate, fern-like patterns of ice. The fire had burned down to a steady, glowing heart of embers. Bram was already gone, his heavy boots having left a path through the silver rime covering the meadow. She stepped outside and gasped. The world had been transformed overnight by a hoarfrost. This happens when the air is moist and the ground is freezing. The water vapor skips the liquid stage and turns straight into ice crystals. Every blade of grass looked like a diamond needle. It was beautiful, but as the cold bit through her thin slippers, she realized beauty in the mountains was often a warning. Bram returned shortly, carrying a heavy yoke with 2 buckets of water. "The creek is starting to skin over," he noted, his breath a white plume. "We have to haul enough for the day before the ice gets too thick to break." He set a task for her, the morning bread. In the Old West, bread wasn't just food, it was life. Most homesteaders used a sourdough starter, a fermented mixture of flour and water that captured wild yeast from the air. Bram's starter had been alive for 3 years, kept in a warm crock near the stones of the hearth. "Treat it like a living thing," Bram warned. "If the crock gets too cold, the yeast dies. If it dies, we don't eat." Verity tried to follow his instructions, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of the city, of the parlor rooms where she had been cast out. She was thinking of the ruined label that felt like a brand on her skin. Distracted, she moved the crock too close to the edge of the stove, wanting to hurry the rise. A few hours later, the smell of burning dough filled the cabin. She pulled the crock back, but it was too late. The high heat had killed the delicate yeast culture and scorched the bottom. The starter, Bram's lifeline, was a gray, lifeless mess.
Verity slumped onto the bench, her tears pricking her eyes. In her old life, a mistake meant a lecture or a deduction in pay. Here, she feared it meant she was useless. She heard Brahm's heavy tread on the porch. He walked in, smelled the air, and looked at the ruined crock. She braced herself, her shoulders hunching. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've ruined it. I ruin everything I touch." Brahm didn't yell. He didn't even sigh. He walked to the cupboard and pulled out a small bag of dried flour. "The mountain doesn't care for apologies, Verity. It only cares for what you do next." He sat across from her and began to scrape away the burnt layers. "We start a new one. It'll take longer, and the bread will be flat for a week, but we start again. That's the rule of the ridge." Verity looked at his large, scarred hands, working with such patience. She realized then that out here, failure wasn't an end, it was just a lesson. But as the wind began to howl through the eaves, she wondered if she had enough strength to keep learning before the real winter arrived.
The patience Bram showed with the sourdough didn't ease Verity's mind. It only made her more hyper-aware of the silence between them. As the days grew shorter, the temperature plummeted. One evening, while the wind hammered against the north wall, Verity noticed a candle flame dancing wildly on the table, even though the door was shut tight. Bram saw it too. He stood up and pressed his hand against the log wall. "The chinking is failing," he muttered. In a log cabin, chinking is the material used to fill the gaps between the logs. It acts as insulation, keeping the warmth in and the predators out. Over time, the logs settle and the clay can crack and fall away. If they didn't fix it before the big white hit, the cabin would become a wind tunnel. The next morning, Bram didn't go to the woods. He stayed at the cabin and brought in a bucket of gray clay, some dried grass, and a bit of lime. He showed Verity how to mix them into a thick, sticky mortar. "The grass gives it fiber," Bram explained as he worked the mixture with a wooden paddle. "It keeps the clay from shrinking and cracking as it dries. It's like a weave. One thing is weak on its own, but put them together and they hold." They worked side by side, pressing the fresh mud into the gaps. It was messy, grueling work. Verity's hands were soon caked in the gray paste. As she reached high to fill a crack near the window, her sleeve pushed back, revealing a series of faint white scars on her forearm, not from a mountain accident, but from the sharp, repetitive nicks of a seamstress's needle and the burns of a laundry press. Bram stopped his work. He looked at her arm, then at her face. Verity froze, her heart hammering. She expected him to ask. She expected him to demand to know what kind of life leaves a woman with such marks. Instead, Bram simply reached out his large, mud-stained hand and handed her his trowel. "You've got a steady hand, Verity. You're precise. That's a rare thing up here." The compliment caught her off guard. In the city, she was just another set of hands in a crowded room, easily replaced and often ignored. Here, her precision was a tool for survival. They worked for hours in a rhythmic trance. She would smooth the mud, and he would follow behind her, tamping it down with a heavy mallet to ensure a tight seal. As the sun dipped behind the shield, the cabin felt different. It was sturdier, quieter. The whistling draft was gone. But as they cleaned the mud from their hands, Verity felt the weight of her trunk in the loft above. She had mended the walls of the house, but the walls around her heart were still riddled with cracks. She looked at Bram, who was now quietly melting a pot of tallow and beeswax to waterproof their boots. He looked so content in his solitude, and she wondered if her presence was truly a help, or if she was just a storm he hadn't yet learned to fear.
The cabin was sealed tight, but the silence inside was growing heavy. As the first true mountain winter began to settle in, the world outside turned into a monochrome landscape of slate-gray skies and skeletal trees. With the outdoor chores limited by the biting frost, Verity found herself trapped with her own thoughts. One afternoon, while Bram was out scouting the timberline for signs of the coming heavy snow, Verity climbed the ladder to the loft. She pulled her battered leather trunk from the shadows. To anyone else, it was just a box of clothes. To her, it was a vessel of shame. She reached into the false bottom and pulled out a small, silk-wrapped bundle. Inside was a silver-backed mirror, a luxury from her past, and a folded newspaper clipping from the city. The headline was faded, but the words still stung. Disgrace at the Miller estate. It detailed a scandal she hadn't caused, but had been forced to carry. In the 1800s, a woman's reputation was her only currency. Once it was spent, she was considered ruined, a social outcast with no hope of a respectable future. She looked at her reflection in the silver mirror. The mountain had changed her. Her cheeks were flushed from the wood stove, and her eyes looked harder, more alert. But as she read those cruel words again, she felt the old heaviness returning. She believed that Brahm, with his quiet dignity and honest work, would never understand a life touched by scandal. She heard the heavy thud of Brahm's boots on the porch, shaking off the snow. Panicked, she shoved the bundle back into the trunk and scrambled down the ladder. Brahm entered, carrying the scent of pine and cold air. He noticed her flushed face and the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. He didn't say a word. He went to the wall and began checking his tools. In the West, your tools were your life. He took down a crosscut saw and began to hone the teeth with a triangular file. "The wind is changing," he said, his voice steady. "The elk are moving into the lower valleys. That means the big snow is only days away. We need to be ready to stay inside for a long time." Educational and survival skills were Brahm's language. He showed her how to read the ring of the saw blade. A clear, bell-like tone meant the steel was healthy, while a dull thud meant a hidden crack. "If the tool is broken deep inside," he murmured, "it'll snap when the pressure is highest." Verity shivered. She felt like that saw blade, carrying a hidden crack that no one could see until the pressure of the winter finally broke her. She watched him work, his movements methodical and calm, and the distance between them felt like a canyon. She was convinced that if he knew the truth, he would see her as a broken tool, unfit for the ridge.
The sky didn't turn black. It turned a ghostly, suffocating white. The big white had arrived. It was a blizzard that erased the horizon and turned the shield into a shadow. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, searching for any weakness in the cabin's logs. Inside, the fire was the only thing keeping the dark at bay. Brahm had prepared well. He had rigged a lifeline, a thick hemp rope, tied from the cabin door to the woodshed. In the Old West, people could get lost and freeze to death just 10 feet from their own front door because the blowing snow was so thick they couldn't see their own hands. But tonight, there was no going out. The world was reduced to these 4 walls. The pressure Brahm had mentioned, the pressure that finds the cracks, was now at its peak. The logs groaned under the weight of the mounting snow. Verity sat by the hearth, her hands shaking as she tried to knit. She felt the secret in her trunk upstairs pressing down through the ceiling boards. The isolation was no longer a sanctuary, it was a mirror. "You're drifting, Verity," Brahm said quietly from his chair across the fire. He was carving a new handle for an adze, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've been 1,000 miles away since the clouds rolled in." The kindness in his voice was the final blow. Verity dropped her knitting. The tears she had held back since the train station finally spilled over. She looked at this man, a man who had given her a home, taught her to survive, and asked nothing but her presence. "I lied to you, not with my words, but with my silence. Back east, they called me a fallen woman, a thief of hearts and a bringer of shame. It wasn't true, but in the city, the truth doesn't matter once the lie is loud enough." She stood up, her shadow dancing wildly on the timber walls. She felt small, broken, and utterly exposed. She walked toward him, the firelight catching the dampness on her cheeks. She looked up at him, her heart laid bare, and whispered the words that had been poisoning her soul. "Will you still keep me if I'm ruined?" The wind gave a final mournful shriek against the chimney, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackle of burning pine. Verity braced herself for the rejection she had practiced 1,000 times in her head. She expected him to point to the door, to the white void outside.
The silence in the cabin stretched thin, vibrating with the force of Verity's confession. Bram didn't flinch. He didn't set down his carving knife with a theatrical thud. He simply looked at the piece of wood in his lap, then up at her, his eyes reflecting the steady amber glow of the hearth. "Ruined," he repeated, the words sounding strange in his deep, gravelly voice. He stood up slowly, his tall frame nearly reaching the ceiling beams. He walked to the corner of the cabin where a large weathered timber supported the main weight of the roof. "Do you see this beam, Verity?" he asked, running a rough hand over the wood. "This is blue-stained pine. Most builders back in the valley would have burned it or tossed it in the scrap heap. They say it's diseased, that the blue streaks mean the wood is ruined by a fungus carried by beetles." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But if you know your craft, you know that the blue stain doesn't weaken the wood. It just changes the color. In fact, that timber is denser and drier than the perfect white pine next to it. It survived the beetle, survived the drought, and now it's the strongest piece of wood in this entire house." He turned back to her, his gaze unwavering. "The world likes to use words like ruined because it makes it easier for them to throw things away. It's a way to avoid looking at the strength it took to survive the damage." Verity felt the air return to her lungs. The shame that had felt like a physical weight began to shift. In the Old West, people often moved toward the sunset to outrun their ghosts. But Bram was teaching her that you didn't have to run. You just had to stand your ground and become part of the structure. "I didn't bring you up here because I thought you were a porcelain doll," Bram said, stepping toward her. "I brought you here because I saw a woman who was willing to get on a train and travel 1,000 miles into the unknown. That's the mark of someone who is ruined. That's the mark of a survivor." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a stray hair behind her ear. His touch was like the heat from the stove, constant and grounding. "I'll keep you, Verity, as long as you want to be kept. Not as a favor, but because this ridge needs someone with your kind of grit." As the storm continued to batter the walls, the cabin no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a fortress. The cracks she feared would break her were suddenly the very things that made her fit for this rugged life.
The emotional peace of that night was soon tested by the brutal reality of the high country. A few weeks after the great storm, the woodpile began to dwindle. Bram, ever the provider, spent 3 days in the waist-deep snow, felling a dead standing larch and hauling the heavy rounds back to the cabin. The work was grueling, and the moisture from his sweat chilled him to the bone in the sub-zero air. By the 4th morning, the rhythm of the cabin was broken. Bram didn't get up to stoke the fire. When Verity climbed down from the loft, she found him still in his bunk, his breathing ragged and shallow. She pressed a hand to his forehead and recoiled. He was burning with a mountain fever. In the 1800s, a fever in the wilderness was a terrifying thing. There were no doctors within a 3-day ride, and the passes were still choked with ice. Verity realized with a jolt that the roles had reversed. The man who had been her shield was now the one who needed protection. She didn't panic. She remembered the lessons Bram had taught her about the medicine of the woods. She bundled up and stepped out into the biting cold, using the lifeline rope to reach the edge of the clearing. She searched for a stand of white willow. The inner bark of the willow contained salicin, a natural precursor to what we now know as aspirin.
Historically, it was a staple for frontier families to reduce inflammation and break a fever. She carefully shaved the bark, making sure not to girdle the tree, which would kill it. Back inside, she boiled the bark into a bitter, dark tea. She also harvested needles from a nearby pine. Pine needle tea is exceptionally high in vitamin C, a vital nutrient for the immune system when fresh fruit was non-existent. For 2 days, Verity didn't sleep. She kept the fire roaring, knowing that if the cabin temperature dropped, Bram's body would lose the energy it needed to fight. She bathed his face with cool melted snow and coaxed the infusions down his throat. As she sat by his side in the dim light, she realized she was no longer the trembling woman from the train station. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. She wasn't just staying on the ridge, she was holding it together. She looked at Bram's face, softened by sleep and sickness, and realized that her value didn't come from a clean reputation back east. It came from the life she was saving right here.
The transition from winter to spring on the ridge isn't a gentle affair. It is a season of violence and noise. The great thaw begins with the sound of ice snapping like pistol shots in the forest. As the snow melts, the once quiet meadow turns into a muddy torrent. This is the time of the freshet, when the mountain sheds its winter coat and the creeks swell with a power that can sweep away boulders. Bran recovered, his strength returning just as the first crocuses pushed through the slush. But as the trails became passable, the peace of their isolation was threatened. One afternoon, the sound of a horse's whinny drifted up the slope. A rider appeared, a circuit-riding mail carrier who visited the remote homesteads twice a year. He brought a small bundle of letters and a heavy air of gossip. As he sat on the porch, sipping the coffee Verity provided, he looked at her with a squint of recognition. "You're the one who came up in the fall, ain't you, from the city?" He pulled a crumpled, month-old newspaper from his saddlebag. "Folks down in Clear Creek are talking. Seems some lawman from back east was asking after a woman of your description. Mentioned something about a missing locket and a broken contract." Verity felt the blood drain from her face. The ruined woman she thought she had buried was being dug up by the spring melt. The rider looked at Bram, waiting for a reaction. In the code of the West, a man's honor was tied to the company he kept. The rider clearly expected Bram to be outraged that he had been tricked into taking in a woman with a clouded past. Bram didn't even look at the paper. He was busy sharpening a plowshare, the rhythmic shing-shing of the whetstone the only sound on the porch. He finally looked up, his eyes as cold and gray as the mountain stone. "The news down in the valley is like the mud. It's thick, it's dirty, and it doesn't belong in my house. This woman saved my life when the fever took me. She's worked this land and mended these walls. Whatever she was before she hit the ridge is none of your concern, and it's certainly none of mine." He stood up, his height casting a long shadow over the messenger. "You can tell whoever is asking that the woman they're looking for doesn't exist anymore. There's only Mrs. Holloway of the Ridge, and we don't care much for visitors who bring nothing but old ghosts." The rider, sensing the iron in Bram's voice, quickly pocketed the paper, tipped his hat, and rode away. Verity stood in the doorway, her hands trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the overwhelming realization that she was finally, truly, protected. By the time the wild roses began to bloom along the creek, the threat from the valley felt like a lifetime ago. The mountain had a way of stretching time, making a single winter feel like a decade of growth. Verity finally did what she had been afraid to do since the day she arrived. She emptied her trunk. She didn't do it in secret this time. She brought her belongings out into the morning sun. She took the silk-wrapped silver mirror and placed it on the small washstand Bram had built for her. It was no longer a symbol of a life she had lost. It was a tool for the life she was building.
The newspaper clipping, the one that called her ruined, went into the belly of the wood stove. She watched the ink curl and vanish into ash, the smoke rising out of the chimney to be lost in the vast blue sky. "It's time to plant," Bram said, appearing at the cabin door with a burlap sack of heirloom seeds. In the late 1800s, seeds were more precious than gold to a homesteader. They were often passed down through generations, selected for their ability to withstand the short, intense growing seasons of the high country. Bram showed Verity how to prepare the soil, mixing in the rich, dark compost they had gathered from the forest floor. "We'll plant the squash and the beans together," Bram explained, demonstrating the ancient practice of companion planting. "The beans provide the nitrogen the soil needs, and the squash leaves shade the ground, keeping the moisture in during the heat of July. They look after one another." She smiled, pressing a seed into the earth. "Like us," she murmured. Bram paused, his large hands covered in the very dirt that would soon feed them. He looked at Verity, not as a stranger he had brought home out of necessity, but as the heart of the ridge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving. It was a tiny, perfectly detailed, blue-stained pine rose. "I made this during the storm," he said, handing it to her, "to remind you that being different doesn't mean being broken. It means being rare." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the shield, casting a golden glow over their little meadow, they sat together on the porch. The silence was no longer heavy or filled with unspoken fears. It was the peaceful silence of two people who had weathered the worst of the winter and come out stronger on the other side. Verity leaned her head against Bram's shoulder. She wasn't a ruined woman seeking a hiding place anymore. She was a woman of the mountains, rooted deep in the rocky soil of the ridge. She had found her redemption not by erasing her past, but by finding a man who knew that the most beautiful lives are often the ones with the most scars.
Thank you for joining us for this journey of redemption and survival on the ridge. Stories like Verity and Bram's remind us that no matter how the world labels us, our true value is found in our resilience and the way we care for one another. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge to join our growing community of Old West storytellers. I want to hear from you in the comments. What part of Verity's journey resonated with you the most? Is there a ridge in your own life where you found peace? Let me know below. For more tales of love and survival, be sure to check out our Stories of the Frontier playlist. Until next time, keep your fire burning bright and your heart open to the trail ahead. Be well.